Welcome to Eyes on Books. I'm Elaine Schnitter, and joining me is Steve Savlo. And we're going to be telling you about a book which we hope you'll really enjoy. The book is by an author by the name of May Knab. And May is actually going to join us after we describe the story a little bit. And she's joining us from Kuwait. She has written her story that's basically set in Kuwait, and we're going to be able to ask her some questions about her story. The name of her book is An Unlasting Home, and we're hoping that we'll churn up some interest in it so that when it's available, you'll be able to read it. It will be out on audio, print, and ebook. The novel takes place primarily in Kuwait, and it focuses on 3 generations of Arab women over a span of about 100 years. The story begins in 2013 when we meet Sarah. Sarah is a young philosophy professor at Kuwait University and was educated in the United States. She had been teaching philosophy at the university for 11 years when something quite unexpected happened to her. She was home after classes one day, and the police showed up at her front door and arrested her for blasphemy. There had been a new law in 2012 which forbid blasphemy, and Sarah was unaware of it. Sarah had been quoting Nietzsche, and one of her female students recorded the class and gave the recording to a very conservative member of Parliament.
The experiences of these 4 women amplify the struggles that they encountered in terms of marriage and education and culture and of just being a woman in such countries as Kuwait, Lebanon, Iraq, Libya, and the US. These struggles are amplified by cultural and religious norms. And you'll find that there have been some changes from, let's say, 100 years ago to more updated in current times. There was also the influence of war, and especially grandfathers and fathers getting killed. The women a long time ago could not vote, or they could not participate in politics. And nowadays it seems that they have more influence. And these 4 women had been uprooted from time to time, going back and forth between Kuwait, India, United States. And so they had to adapt. And Sarah actually had to learn a new language, which was Iraqi, and that was kind of intimidating to her, but she got some lessons and became fluent in Iraqi. So this was a very informative book for me as a man, looking at how the role of women in Kuwait or even in the Middle East in terms of the influences of culture and laws and how their daily life actually progressed.
Things that they did struggle with also is loyalty. At one point, Sarah's grandmother was called back to come to help with her brother, who supposedly was ill. Her grandmother had been living in India, and she came back to Kuwait to help out. But when she got there, she found out that her mother wasn't telling her the truth. Her mother just wanted her there, didn't want her living a nice life in India. She really was jealous of her. And the poor girl ended up staying there for 7 years with her son before the mother finally let her loose and let her go back to her husband in India. But the girl and her mother had a very interesting relationship, and the girl felt responsible for the mother and was very loyal to the mother and wanted to take care of her in spite of the way she had been hoodwinked.
And what's interesting also is that the other siblings, because of the mother's, dictatorial style, stayed away.
Yeah.
And actually the grandmother had the key to the door and she hid it, so nobody can come in or go out.
Yeah.
And so she was kind of held hostage.
Yeah, she was held hostage, but it was, what we found out later in the story was she actually could have left but didn't, because she felt that loyalty to her mother and wanted to make sure her mother was taken care of.
Right.
Another
Another interesting another interesting point was that Sarah was in the United States, and she felt really comfortable there. She wanted to stay there, but her husband Tariq wanted to go back to India because he was go back to Kuwait because he was wanting to help his country.
Mm-hmm.
And so Sarah decided that, her love for Tariq was bigger than her wanting to stay.
Mm-hmm.
And so she went to Kuwait and just thought that was interesting,
Mm-hmm.
again, in terms of the culture and the subservient point of view some of the women had towards their husbands.
Yeah, and that was Nora. And Nora actually had wanted an education and had
Nora, I'm sorry.
majored in political science in St. Louis, where her husband was doing a medical residency, and had a degree in political science. When they went back to Kuwait, as Steve said, she ended up not being able to use her education at all because women were not allowed to participate in politics. But what she did, which was kind of clever, she opened a bookshop, and she was able to smuggle in some restricted books that she was able to share with people. So she did actually have a little success. Right.
Books seem to be another character in this story because they had the bookstore and many of the children wanted to learn, and especially the female children were raised to stay home and take care of the kids and run the household.
Yes, it was a lot of things to think about in this book, in addition to the culture and the history and the politics and all of that we tend to hear about. A lot of everyday living going on and a lot of struggles for everyone.
I couldn't put the book down, actually. I mean, I just want to know what's happening next to which character and so on. So I really highly recommend this book.
Yes, we do. And thank you for joining us. And we're going to introduce May in just a few minutes. So hang on. Okay, now we have a big treat in store for you. I'm going to introduce you to May Al-Nakab, who is going to tell us about her book. And it is called An Unlasting Home, and we'll be getting some good information from her about not only her story, but about a lot of the issues that occur in the Middle East. I hope our questions are appropriate.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me here. I'm really excited to be part of this.
Yeah, we're very happy to have you, and we feel quite privileged having early copies of your book and being able to be ahead of the game on it. In fact, when we've been telling friends about this, they want to know where they can get it. So we told them they'll have to wait. So one of the things we were wondering right off is what are the situations right now with women in Kuwait? Your book ended in 2013, and there seemed to be quite a bit of repression. And we were just wondering, has anything changed since then, or is it essentially the same?
So in terms of women's lives in Kuwait today, they really do enjoy a lot of freedom in a lot of areas. So for example, in terms of jobs and careers and how they dress and driving and traveling and owning property, all of those kinds of things, women have the right to those, to those aspects of control over their own lives. In terms of voting and participating in politics, they also have the right to that. Since 2005, women have been allowed to vote and participate in politics. So that is there too. Mm-hmm. The issues that that women face in Kuwait have to do with the family law, which follows some of the things that are connected to Sharia law or Islamic law. So for example, things to do with inheritance rights, for example. And another thing that women deal with is that if they marry non-Kuwaiti men, their children don't have the right to citizenship. And then there are also cultural and traditional elements and pressures that women have to deal with. And this depends on the kind of family that they come from, that there are constraints, patriarchal constraints that they may face. Again, depending on the kind of family that they come from. So the more conservative the family, the more control over their lives. So there are issues that women have to deal with.
I'm Steve, and just wanted to ask you a question about the men. Have the men become a little bit more progressive?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing is, even in this novel, you may have noticed that a lot of the fathers, the brothers, even men that may not necessarily be related to the women characters are really supportive of these women in the ways that they can be. So, the men, even in the past, so it isn't so much that they're progressing today, but even in the past, in the Middle East, in Kuwait, there are examples of male figures who are super supportive of the women in their lives.
Wonderful.
The issues that women have faced historically and even today have much more to do with the patriarchal systems that control their lives rather than individual men that affect their lives. So I think that we're definitely seeing improvement when it comes to men being more progressive. The system is becoming more progressive, I think, as well. But I think it's too easy to say that they were conservative and are becoming more progressive. I think there were supportive men all along.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
And what about the 2012 law forbidding blasphemy, which was a very central issue in your book? Did that come about for any specific reason, or just religious conservatism?
Exactly. So, religious conservatism was on the rise in Kuwait. And by 2000, this was on the rise for, a variety of complicated political reasons. But by 2012, we had a very conservative parliament in place, and they had passed a blasphemy law. And then in 2013, they passed an amendment to that law, making it a capital crime. So there was a sort of a blasphemy law first that was sort of you'd be imprisoned or you'd have to pay a fine. But by 2013, this amendment was passed by a wide majority in Parliament, making it a capital crime, which was very unusual in Kuwait because capital punishment in Kuwait is rare. It's not that it doesn't exist. It exists, but it's very, very rare. And
Oh,
this was really unusual. And it did not pass by, it has to go through the cabinet of ministers and the emir, and it did not pass. The reasons really just has to do with a general conservative push at the time in Kuwait, and the parliament was and still remains rather conservative. And so that's why that came about. And it was really quite shocking to people in Kuwaiti society in general. You know, I was really blown away by this law. It was just a shock. So that's really how it came about.
Okay. You know, India and Kuwait have been trading partners for thousands of years. And it turns out that India supported Iraq in its move into Kuwait. And I'm just wondering if that had any influence on the current trading policy and about the feelings between the two countries.
So you're right that the history of relations between Kuwait and India go back for really millennia, because there's evidence on one of the islands of Kuwait that connects. There are artifacts that demonstrate that the relations go back that long. You know, through trade, through travel across the Indian Ocean, and so on. Kuwaiti families had connections between in India. They owned property, they had businesses, just like the family in the novel, the Al-Mustafa family. Even up until 1961, Kuwait shared the Indian rupee was the legal tender in Kuwait because of the shared history of British colonialism. Now, in terms of India's support of Iraq, they didn't exactly support Iraq because they did call on Iraq many times to leave Kuwait. So what they didn't do was they didn't participate in the coalition. I mean, India considers itself to be a non-aligned state. So they didn't participate in the coalition to fight, and they didn't participate in the war to liberate Kuwait. I mean, India had a lot to lose, both in terms of its relationship with Iraq and Kuwait. I mean, at the time, it exported 40% of its oil from Kuwait and Iraq. So it didn't want to get on the wrong side of either. Exactly. And in terms of the relationship today, in terms of trade and all of that is still maintained. Relations between Kuwait and India are very strong. India continues to import oil from Kuwait, and Kuwait imports all kinds of things from India, from mangoes all the way to machinery. There's lots of things that Kuwait imports from India. And there are around 825,000 Indian nationals that work in Kuwait, doctors, nurses, engineers, all kinds of high caliber professionals, all the way to laborers and domestic helpers. So, Indian nationals depend a lot on the remittances that come from Kuwait to India from these workers. So there is a really strong relationship between the two countries still. I don't think that the invasion damaged that relationship.
Oh, okay. We weren't quite sure how all of that worked. You did mention about 2012 and 13 with the blasphemy laws. But what we noticed in the book was during the 90s, things seemed to change as far as the conservatism taking hold, because we were amazed before that things were much different among the Kuwaitis. Was that just happening everywhere in the Middle East at that time, or what was the trend?
I think that, the rise in conservatism in Kuwait really started, you could detect it from the late 1970s. And I think in part this had to do with the Islamic revolution that happened in Iran. This influenced the region entirely, both in terms of the Shia populations in Kuwait and elsewhere, but also the Sunni population, almost in response to what was happening in Iran. Everything started to move in a more conservative direction. But it still hadn't, while it was slowly rising up until 1990, it hadn't really gone in the direction that it would after the liberation of Kuwait. And I think there are many reasons for why this shift took place. Part of it had to do with, I think, the fact that Saudi Arabia had more of an influence on Kuwait after the liberation. And, it could be that because of a lot of Kuwaitis spent the year in exile in Saudi Arabia, so maybe they were influenced by that.
Okay, yeah.
I think another major part had to do with the fact that our demographic shifted toward a more Bedouin population. And there were many political reasons for how this shift took place. I won't get into all of that. But the Bedouin population tends to be more tribal, more conservative, more traditionalist, and they became the majority of our population very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And that changed things.
Yeah, I did read that about the Bedouins, and that caused some of the changes. So, well, thank you for enlightening us. We sit over here and know far little about the Middle East, far less than we should.
This was a history lesson.
Yes, it was.
Thank you. It is a complicated place. I mean, even a country as small as Kuwait has a really rich and complicated history, and it's hard to unpack the politics.
Well, we learned a lot from your book. We really did, and we appreciate it.
I'm glad. That makes me really happy. I'm so happy to hear that.
Okay, go ahead.
We noticed in your book, you exemplified 5 different women. I mean, some were related, but how is it that you chose these 5 women versus, let's say, 2 or 3 women? Is there something behind that?
I think that I had a sense when I started working on this novel that I wanted to write a kind of multi-generational epic. I wanted it to be very expansive. I wanted it to be really rich and teeming. And I knew I wanted to write about women in the region. When I first started out writing the story, it started out with the Lulwa and Yasmin stories. And at the time, they didn't overlap. I really didn't have a sense of how their stories would connect. I just trusted that they would somehow connect. And I just wrote it back and forth exactly in the way that it appears now. It was really in 2013 when this whole thing with the blasphemy law happened, and I was just so shocked with the news. And, I was just devastated. It was just such a shock, and it was so frightening to think about how would this law affect me. I started thinking about, I teach at Kuwait University. Would this affect me? Are there courses that I teach that could be construed as blasphemous? And I figured, yes, absolutely. And it was really, I think, the next day that I started writing the Sara chapter and, the accusation of blasphemy and so on. And then it started to come to me, this idea that these women that I was writing about, Lulwa and Yasmin, would be the grandmothers of Sara, this woman that was accused. And then after that, it was the story of her mother came into it. And because of Noura, her mother's connection to India, Maria's story came into play. And it was really in that way that it kind of came together, that it was going to be the story about these 5 women that are related, that are connected, and that it is the 4 women that shape the protagonist, Sara. It is their lives that really contribute to her sense of who she is, and really the storylines all mixed together for me.
Sure do.
So that's why there are 5 of them.
Well, you did a wonderful job with all 5, and that was no easy task, I'm sure, to develop those 5 women.
I think the theme of home being unlasting was also important, and that's in the title. This idea that that they're wandering, and it comes that the title "An Unlasting Home" comes from James Joyce's "A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man." There's a lovely quote.
Oh, okay, nice.
Yeah, and it's in the author's note at the end, and in that in that quote from Joyce, he talks about that they're like birds that wander, and this wandering, constantly wandering, and that this is not a bad thing. wandering doesn't have to be construed as something negative, because in that wandering and movement, there is transformation, there is possibility. And I really had a sense of the characters. I mean, not that the movement always brings them good things, but there is something potentially productive about that movement. And so I saw that as a key theme.
Well, we're getting signals here. We need to finish up. But the one thing we are very curious about, we live in Orange County, and I live in Mission Viejo, and I am dying to know how you brought those locations into your story.
Okay. I mean, so there's no reason why Sara and her family had to be in Mission Viejo. That is purely because of me. Because for me growing up, we spent, from when I was 11 till the age of 21, my family and I spent summers in Mission Viejo. My parents had family and friends in Orange County, in Mission Viejo, Laguna Niguel. And so we ended up coming there and spending our summers there, and we really loved it. And it was a very important part of my life.
Before you go, we do want to ask you if you're working on something else right now.
I am. I'm working on a novel that is set on the island of Felica. So the island that I mentioned that has these relics and evidence of trade between Kuwait and India. So I'm writing the story about a middle-aged woman who returns to the island to escape something that's happening on the mainland. And it's set about 10 to 15 years into the future. So I'm doing a lot of research on the island of Felica now. And
Thank you again, May. We appreciate it. And our audience is going to love hearing about your book.
We thank you for tuning in to Eyes on Books. And if you have any books that you think might make an interesting discussion, or authors who are good speakers, we'd love to hear your suggestions. Contact us at eyesonbooks@yahoo.com. And keep watching.